All right, so I will have a confession to make. Everybody probably is more beholden to one than the other. So I did grow up. I saw Star Wars when I was 5 years old, and that sort of took root. So if I had to describe myself, if I had to pick a team, I was first, at least, a Star Wars child. But Star Wars at that point didn't have all the extra material and cartoons and everything that it has now. So waiting 3 entire years when you're, 5 to 8, 8 to 11 for those original movies, that was a long time. So between there, in syndication, was a little show called Star Trek. So I could get weekly doses. And of course, as a kid, I think even though I went through 60-something episodes, by the time they rolled around, I probably forgot I probably watched them 3-4 times in a row in all those years. So as far as consumption, probably a lot more Star Trek than Star Wars. Watched alongside my dad and dreaming of growing up to articulate myself a little bit like William Shatner. So, Gene Roddenberry, 50 years ago, even though he articulated Star Trek as being a Western in outer space, final frontier, right? You kind of got it right there. You have this idea, which he explained to the public, that it was wagon train to the stars. But at the same time, he privately told friends that he was modeling it on Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, intending each episode to act on 2 levels, as a suspenseful adventure story, sure, and as a morality tale. And so over 50 years, the mythology of Star Trek, from classic series to Next Generation, Deep Space, etc., all the way back around to classic Reborn now, has sought to, in some ways, propel us forward, to sort of try to get humanity to move at warp speed along the vision of Gene Roddenberry. And really the basis of that in a lot of ways, not just with Spock as one of the most popular characters, but the idea of logic, reason, evolution, advancement, technology. Through all of these things, eventually we will become a benevolent race. As I think Captain Picard said in one of the previous films, we've outgrown greed, we've overcome poverty, our petty grievances, we've effectively achieved a utopia, and now it's about taking that out to the other spaces and corners of the universe, joining with other enlightened races to take that discipleship to the stars to enlighten others. And so just as far as working on Earth half a century later, how's that holding up? Everything's perfect now, right? Roddenberry stated, and this was his tactic too. It's a little bit of what we call obfuscation. Do something for the networks, have some phaser fights, have some, good old Kirk two-handed, punch, and then he could slide something in. He said, by creating a new world with new rules, I could make statements about sex, religion, Vietnam, politics, intercontinental missiles, etc. Indeed, we did make them on Star Trek. We were sending out messages, and fortunately, they all got by the network. If you talked about purple people on a far-off planet, they never really caught on. They were more concerned, Roddenberry said, about cleavage. They actually would send a sensor down to the set to measure a woman's cleavage to make sure too much of her was not showing. Roddenberry intended the show to have a progressive political agenda reflective of the emerging culture of his era, though he wasn't fully forthcoming with the networks. He wanted to show humanity what it might develop into. Issues depicted in the various series included, obviously war and peace, personal loyalty, authoritarianism, imperialism, class warfare, economic issues, racism, religion, human rights, sexism, feminism, and the role of technology. I'm glad we got all those problems licked. Now, if anything, we were walking into this century feeling in some ways, I think even this year in particular, as if we are more polarized than ever, as if we are more tribal than ever, as if we live in our own little echo chambers and just lob grenades at the other people. Star Trek sought to take us beyond, and I think part of the problem was there's a vision of taking us beyond, as this movie even grabs for its title. But beyond what? Talk about how things come full circle. Here you have Roddenberry's vision. He's joking about how the prudish networks were only concerned about cleavage. And so he's sliding all these deep metaphors and messages to totally change culture while they're concerned about their silly, prudish things. If you guys remember Into Darkness, the last Star Trek film, what was it that progressive culture was so incensed about in that second film? That they had a character, they had the female character just get immodestly undressed. That was progressive culture's complaints. Everything's come full circle. The progressives are sliding messages under, and now they've grown up to the ones measuring cleavage. Everything has come, for better or worse, no matter how you want to parse that out, the thing that was progressive is now become unacceptable. Everything's flipped on its head. Everything's circular. Our logic and reasoning has just shifted gears. Our arguments have even switched sides. Optimistic, but perhaps unrealistic. And in fact, as we look at science fiction itself, even reading some modern sci-fi, I've been in a science fiction book club. I expected a nerd or something to shout it out, but I'm in a science fiction book club. We're actually reading one of the Hugo Award winners of the last few years, talking about cosmic sociology and modern thinking about what it'll be like when we encounter alien races, and that optimistic view of Roddenberry that when you reach a certain point, you sort of become benevolent by nature, is not the common train of thought scientifically or philosophically at all as we think about races that might actually be out there. In fact, there may just be as much reason. Advancement may just as likely bring domination and the need for eliminating competition. Actually, talk about that. By observation itself, nature makes as much a case for survival of the fittest as it does for an interreliant ecosystem. And so Star Trek is grabbing at this idea that we aspire to something, but it is something that is not necessarily natural. But yet we get it through the perspective of what we see there at the end in this film, all the way back from the old show, the dynamic trio. And maybe not even the dynamic trio of Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. I know we think of them like they're the three main characters, and then there's the slightly wider ensemble. But we have these three characters often thrown into things to explore, to test our own perspectives. And for what masquerades as an ensemble, maybe less of one than you think. Roddenberry designed Star Trek around mythological storytelling dynamics, including this dynamic trio. The question is it truly three persons, or is it 3 in 1? Because if you look at Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, they really all are an argument that each of us often has internally, what psychology often talks about, the id, the ego, the superego. You have the character with desire, pursuit, get it done, I need to meet the needs of the moment, counteracted by logic and weighing the reality of the situation. And then there's that moral critique. Jim, Spock, how could you? Those are often things that go on in our own head. The demands of the situation with the reality of the situation, and then the ethics of the situation pressed together into a singular argument. Through these three people, we have a converging set of perspectives that sort of mind meld together. And this film, though, it seems as if the crux of Beyond grabs, from my perspective, three characters but a little bit different. We actually get a character and ideas of being lost and feeling bound, and then a new character in Jayla that is actually found and discovered. So I want to explore those a tiny bit as we had just watched the film and hopefully had some fun with it. But it begins with Kirk and that great nod to the old series, which ran for how many seasons? 3. We have the 3 seasons, so here they're 3 years into the voyages, and he says things are starting to feel a little what? Episodic. That was a nice nod to the TV show. But he says, I find myself wondering what it is we're trying to accomplish. What are we doing out here? In fact, he even says, if the universe is truly endless, are we not striving for something forever out of reach? And he's got these principles ingrained in him, and probably somebody's told him life's about the journey, but he's starting to think, but ultimately to what end? Like, to what end is all of this for? What is that ultimate end goal, and what can it ever really hope to accomplish? It's actually reflective of one of the previous movies. They had a nice nod to the old movie series, whereas older men, Kirk and McCoy, are having a drink together, celebrating a birthday, questioning purpose, questioning meaning, questioning what they've done. And I think in some ways, if you look at this movie and 50 years of Star Trek, maybe this whole thing could be a bit of commentary on Roddenberry's vision itself. Kirk in this version is actually very different. Remember, we had a timeline alteration back a couple movies ago. He says, my dad joined Starfleet because he believed in it. I joined on dare. Right? Captain Pike dared him to do better. And Bones clarifies it a little bit. He says he joined to see if he could live up to your father. And actually, if you watch the second film, to also live up to Captain Pike, who he sees as a father figure as well. But he joined on a dare. He joined in defiance. He joined because he was a man filled with things he was kind of angry and opposed to. In fact, so did Spock in this version, if you remember. He's actually planning to join the Vulcan Academy, and when they insult his mother, he takes Starfleet instead. He's like, no, forget you. I'm not going to be defined by this Vulcan way. I'm going to go the other way. And so we actually see people who are kind of defining themselves by what they're against or what they're not. And then we see in this film, Spock then feels duty-bound to his forebear, not his father. Spock is, it's alternate timeline Spock, but kind of, again, this father-like figure in Leonard Nimoy's character. And his heart is now in Starfleet, but now he feels this duty to his people. He feels the duty to old Spock's legacy. He has to give up what he wants. He's kind of trapped by doing what he feels must be right, what he's interpreting as right, and he has to do that. And so this film's struggling with, what are we defined by? We can't be defined by what we're against or simply what our forebears believed. I can't just say I'm doing it because Dad did it. Well, why was Dad doing it? Or we have to think through those things. What do we actually believe in? We're just following blindly in the footsteps of fathers, unquestioningly. Right? If we did that, maybe some of us would be walking some good paths. But if we did that as a nation, we'd still have slaves of different color. Right? As we get older, we have to ask, what are the presuppositions upon which we're operating on our mission from? Right? We're often operating on all these base assumptions. Well, you're supposed to do this, Jim. Your father did this. Do better. Good people do X. This is where we come from. This is how we go forward. They're axioms and platitudes, but they all have underlying presuppositions. And here we have this idea that as he's going out further and further into the galaxy, because he doesn't have roots, he's sort of losing himself. And then in Crawl, we see somebody who has completely lost himself. He says, the farther we go out, the more I find myself wondering, what are we trying to accomplish? He said, perhaps a break from routine will offer up some respite from mysteries of the unknown, but for this crew of the Star Trek, they never get a respite, although they always face the unknown. But then we see the darkest aspect of what we can do if we lose our identity. If we get lost in the doing, if we're lost in the forever pushing forward, and not questioning what it is that we're actually standing on, if we're just push the frontier, if you're not grounded, you just wind up floating off. You're doing the job so long you forget the presuppositions that got you there. You forget the foundation, and suddenly it blurs the federation that you were so ardent for. And we become distorted versions of our former self. That's the danger of Idris Elba's character Crawl in this. That's the danger of having our ideals internally perverted by our own lack of perhaps sound doctrine, if you will, sound grasp on what those were. We see he's suffering from fatigue and doubt and confusion and regret and blame and vengeance. If we can't grab hold of one of those as something we've felt, come on. Just think for a moment. Whether we're just tired, or whether we're angry, or whether we want to shift the blame, we've all been in a similar place, even if we didn't have that much of a bad morning face, I guess. Right? And then we actually see somebody else who is similarly lost and tempted to some of the same motivations. Right? Jayla honestly feels very much betrayed by life and the hand she's been dealt. She's been hurt by others, and she wants revenge. Equally tempted to kind of have a vengeance-based foundation. She's lost her parents. Life is really just about survival, and yet she's living in the ruins of something which is fascinating and seems to be of far greater importance. And I love this. Because in fact, for everybody in the movie, the Yorktown kind of represents this need to, they have to resurrect this old beast of a ship. And then, in fact, they have to find some classical music to defeat the bad guys. Classical, going back as far as Beastie Boys. But right, they find this old vehicle of pioneering promise and an old song that helps them overcome and actually destroys the enemies and brings salvation. They find the ruins and foundations of an undiluted federation. And that's really the thing that propels them to their next enterprise, if you will. And Jael even calls it her home. She's like, this is my home. But she barely understands it. Now, she reminds me of a character in the Bible who's an Ethiopian, and he's looking at this foundational document. He's like, I don't understand. Somebody explain this to me. Somebody shared it. This seems like an incredible thing. I'm enjoying its fruits. Could you actually, show me the bigger picture of this thing? I've got this. Explain it to me. And then ultimately, what does she end up doing? She ends up becoming a Starfleet disciple. She's living in a foundation established by others, but she's kind of a child about it. And not in a denigrating way. As she understands what she can, and is actually using it pretty effectively for what she knows how to use it for. But its meaning's been lost, and its power is seemingly gone. She has no way to change it. It's just sitting there waiting. And so all the characters, from Spock, does he need to leave the uniform aside? Kirk, will he retire from his captaincy role? Will he do something else and get out of this pioneering role because he's lost himself? And then at the end, will Jayla take up the mantle and join Starfleet? It's how and when will we take up or endure or maintain the uniform? Even if it comes with, as we see in this movie, some responsibility, some heartache, and some loss, and some endurance. Heavier hearts, perhaps, but somehow it's still worth it. That's kind of the heart of this film aspect of Star Trek. Is there something worth fighting for? Kirk has to wrestle with, will I continue? Spock, it's kind of like, is there a more important alternative? Is there something more important I need to do? And it all comes down to what lenses we use to view the world. Right? We have Krall's view. We have our trio of characters, once again, just engaging the world. McCoy with his wonderful curmudgeon sensibilities. And so we have this vision set down, this ideal of Kirk's versus the condemned view of Krall. And of course, it comes down to things, he seems very selfish, and he seems to be all wrapped up in, he's now living long, literally feeding off of others for longer life. And yet the characters, of course, he seems to look down on the unity and teamwork that the crew of the Starship Enterprise employs. He denigrates that. And so there's always been this idea in Star Trek about unity and about family, kind of that main family and ensemble. And the question is teamwork and family enough? I mean, is unity really an end goal? I mean, Kirk at the beginning, he's just like, we're bringing this message, we're bringing people into this alliance, we're bringing people into this federation so that we're all unified and working together. So that what? We'll seek out new life and new civilizations, so together we can seek out new life and new civilizations, so then together we can seek out new life. Right? That seems like a great means toward an end. It's not an end. It's cyclical. It's circular. Unity for why? For unity's sake. On that alone, one could argue, you can say that's great, but is it truly a virtue? In fact, sacrifice itself. He asks Uhura, what will your captain do? She's like, well, he'll sacrifice for us, just like I'd sacrifice my life for him. Well, is that a virtue? Who tells us that's a virtue? Kirk would have done the same for me, she says. There's this solidarity and sacrifice that defies logic and even defies the idea of a creature in regards to survival. But yet you and I, most of us by default, would say it seems right. What makes sacrifice right and selfishness wrong? Who said that? The universe? The cold, unfeeling accident that we all find ourselves in? Well, if that's how you think it started, there's nothing to say that that's a virtue. In fact, what is virtue? What is it that we're fighting so hard against, too? Because you know what? If nature doesn't lift up sacrifices of virtue, then actually we're fighting against our nature, aren't we? Right? Kroll actually says, conflict is what drives us, not the pursuit of peace. In fact, he later says, this is what I was born into. I don't know about you, but I was born into a world where there's struggle. I was born into a world where there was conflict. But who really says peace is the ultimate goal or answer? What if struggle is the point? When we're just two people arguing 2 points of an argument, who can say whether we're right or wrong? It was actually fascinating. I was reading a political article. Somebody's interviewing the ex-Daily Show comedian Jon Stewart. And he was talking about how tribalism is natural. Tribalism is our natural state, to create a tribe and then have the other and hate the other. In fact, he's like, he said the American experiment, which in many ways was Roddenberry's hope that America would be this pioneering force. The American experiment is a war against thousands of years of nature. So here you see again, as we talk about Star Trek and we talk about the platitudes and we talk about the axioms, think about it for a minute. How come we cherry pick when nature is actually good and bad? Right? Is our nature something that we use to justify our desires? Well, it's my nature, so that means you can't tell me I can't live out that. That's my nature, right? Oh, but no, but if tribalism is natural and we should actually be about unity and peace and fight our nature, well, who gets to decide when my nature is something to be fought and something that justifies my actions or validates them and they should be accepted? Who makes those calls? What do we look to go beyond our nature, or where do we say, well, this is in me and thus it's right? If part of what we must do is transcend our nature, if we're supposed to go beyond, then where do we look to? That's one of the things that Star Trek and a lot of these stories never quite, they sense that we need something, but they never quite grab it. And that's okay. I don't expect, a syndicated TV show or a summer blockbuster movie to give you the answer. But I love that it provokes the questions. Questions like who and what defines the better path? Right, in a previous film, Pike says, I dare you, Kirk, to do better. So part of what drives him is that. But better than your dad, apparently, isn't a good enough reason. In this movie, it's like, I can't just be doing it to one-up my dad. I can't just be doing it because dad thought it was good. I can't just be better than everyone else. That's just comparison. And then on top of that, who defines better? Is better stronger, faster, winning, right? Is better peace? If it's not what we're born into, if it's not the natural state of the universe that we find ourselves, then how do we say Kroll's path is wrong? Kirk doesn't want to become Kroll, but what truly does he want to become? In fact, at one point, he really just uses an argument that has no greater strength than Kroll's. Kroll says, I was born into conflict. Conflict is the way. What does Kirk say? He's like, better to die for others. That's what I was born into. Well, right, that's just loggerheads. Well, I was born into this one, so I say it's right this way. Well, I was born into this one, so I say it's right this way. Well, which one? How? What do you do with that? So we're bound to what we were born into? Well, I was born into this religion, or I was born into this philosophy, or I was born into this family. I'm kind of stuck with its principles. I'm stuck there. And Kirk, of course, let's say, compared to Kirk and Kroll, I mean, no surprise to probably most of you, I hope. I like that Kirk veers toward the other direction. I'd say his way is better. But he sort of lands back in this vague acceptance of unity and virtue and never quite lands the plane or lands the starship into exactly why. In fact, he says to Kroll, he says, we change because we have to. Is that virtuous? Is that noble? That's just necessity. That doesn't get my gears going either. We change because we have to, or we're just stuck in the same cycle. Well, that might again be something that sounds like something I have to do to survive, not something I ought to do because it has any sense of meaning or truth or beauty. I think the seeds for something better are sprinkled through the universe of Star Trek. And I think in this film, Jayla best sort of lives that out, this idea that we're living in a house built on a basis that we don't quite understand, or maybe we've forgotten. That maybe we are, in many ways, living out the elements and ideas of a federation, but without the foundation that used to be there. We live in a nation scrabbling for identity right now. We might disagree on who's the crawl in our most recent scenarios, right? But we see a lot of people out there. We see a lot of people who just seem to have disregarded virtue. And we see a lot of people clinging to virtue. But if you actually ask them questions, they've got no better answers for what actually gives those virtues roots and realities. The reality is, we were founded as a nation by fathers who at least knew it stood on pillars of how we were created, what we were created with, and what we were created for. In their minds, if we were living out Roddenberry's vision, we would be going out to tell aliens why we have inalienable rights. And they come from a creator. See, a lot of us, so many Americans, rest in the framework of a ship and enjoy a whole bunch of its freedoms and fruits, but don't really have the foundation. We employ fragments of the reasoning, but we're so messed up because none of us are connecting them to the roots. In fact, we enjoy elements of the teaching that enable us to live in peace without acknowledging the teacher. We have platitudes without a sustaining basis, and we need somebody to call us back to something better and something true. That's true freedom, and it's freeing, not binding. And that's where we see Spock's character has to kind of has to understand. Kirk winds up continuing in those footsteps of Dad, right? He's got the Starfleet uniform, he's going to be a captain. He even perhaps goes on to do greater things than his dad in Starfleet and leadership. Spock doesn't leave Starfleet to follow his predecessor to the sort of the letter of the law. Well, my old Spock or my forebear was doing this, I'm bound to follow in this. There's diversity within the beauty of being this federation. He sees the picture of the old crew at the end, right, which tugs at my heartstrings. And he knows he needs to follow the spirit of his surrogate Spock-like father, not the letter. He's still following in the footsteps, but it's still, he has the freedom within that diversity. I mean, my dad was a pastor. I'm a pastor. That doesn't mean that discipleship for everybody means walking in those same footsteps. There's diversity within unity. And so what truly is the final frontier? See, I just don't think space is the final frontier, guys. Right? Explore, seek out, boldly go. But again, to what end? To what purpose? So the real question is, you want to know the logical fallacy, not of Roddenberry or Star Trek, but just maybe this movie? Kirk makes the quote, he says, if space is truly endless, then, well, actually, science, to the best of all 20th century possibilities, would say that it's not endless. So that's a little summer blockbuster fallacy. Right? We believe that best of science would say, no matter whether this beginning was let there be light or a big bang, we had a beginning which is leading to entropy or ending. As then I was reading that modern science fiction book about cosmic sociology, we are headed toward a bleak ending. Because as everything is exploded and it's exploding outward and spreading, eventually like a ball thrown across a field, or like a firecracker kicking up a bunch of dirt, that eventually is going to find its natural rest. It's eventually going to run out of energy. And as that begins to run out of energy, along with quieting energy, we also have shrinking resources. And the best of cosmic sociology would understand that as the universe winds down, the only way anyone will survive is if they form alliances and tribes and hoard the resources as the light slowly begins to flicker toward extinction. Will devolve into tribalism again, an alliance against an inevitable end. In other words, the frontier will push back. So if that's our final frontier, the material world and its inevitable snuffing, we're in trouble. I don't think our answers are in the stars or our final frontiers in the stars or these stories. In fact, Kirk says, we've got no ship, no crew, how are we going to get out of this one? And Spock says, which isn't quite logical, he says, we will find hope in the impossible. Well, what I believe I would designate as impossible, but it's certainly beyond the scope of the material. And I love when you tie together what all three of the guys say, and you kind of have that conundrum. Kirk asks, what are we trying to accomplish? And then as they're facing crisis, Spock says, fear of death is illogical. McCoy says, fear of death is what keeps us alive. Well, there has to be some right and wrong mixed in there. Is fear what keeps us alive, or is fear of death ultimately illogical? Is fearing something beyond death perhaps able to ameliorate that? Can we rest in something beyond that establishes our foundations and our virtues and actually takes away fear of death? Could it be a resurrected foundation or an old familiar song? That's the mystery of the gospel that Christians cling to, which I think answers all the best questions of Roddenberry and Star Trek's philosophy. Only in Christianity have I seen the fullness of Star Trek's vague aspiration. The gospel of Jesus Christ uniquely paints a picture of followers commissioned to be ambassadors going out to bring peace and unity and reconciliation, to bring a message that in Christ fear of death is illogical. Fear of death may be what keeps others alive, but fear of God is what opens the door to life everlasting. The character of God is what drives our virtues. And trusting God in his initiating sacrifice is what assures us of life beyond. In that, there is a mission that transcends a fading universe. There's a unity that mirrors and models an objective perfection in heaven. As Scotty tells Jayla, she's part of something bigger now. That only matters if we're disciples of something that's true and something that lasts. So I love the optimism of Roddenberry's vision, but it's seeking it in the material and the flawed humans. I fear all too often we will wind up looking confused like Kirks or dark like Kralls. There needs to be something else, which I think is only found in Christ. So this is why I think it is an important mythology to our culture today, but it has to be driven beneath the layers of gloss and lens flares and spaceships to the real conversation. And I'd encourage you guys, particularly in the realm of sci-fi, as we see even its writers are purposefully putting morality plays and tales into them. Don't miss it for your own enjoyment. Also don't miss it for possible conversation. Let's pray. God, we thank you that we could just go a little bit beyond the surface of Justin Lin's film and the cast and crew that put together this Star Trek feature. God, I love that you have invested in us the ability to have aspirations, yearnings for many of the things we see in these characters. And I know some of them reflect ways we yearn and reach and grasp in our own lives. And I know for many of us, we have many friends that also yearn and grasp without any sense of exacting answers. And so I pray you'd make us students and disciples of your word, but also stories like this, that we could be inspired to be reminded of the hope that we have, and then to bring it to those who only have warp speed phasers and dreams of things about which you in Christ have made reality. Let us have a good night and a good weekend, and hopefully continue our journey with you as we do get to explore not just new worlds, but new life, new relationship, new wonders that you have for us in your name.